She hid in the most feared duke's carriage to escape a forced marriage. As the man hunting her peered through the glass with a lantern, his face twisted in a predatory grin, the duke pulled her close and whispered 3 words she had never once been given in her entire life.
Shh. It's all right. I'll protect you.
Zelda Wallace didn't know the man sitting in the shadowed corner of that velvet-lined carriage was Frederick Burkett, the Duke of Ashvale, the one nobleman all of London whispered about in genuine terror. She only knew that Robert Ray, the man she had been sold to in marriage, was going to own her body, her name, and her silence, to settle a debt her father had spent years building and one terrible evening finally lost. The lace of her wedding gown was damp with rain and tears. She had run 4 blocks in satin slippers before diving into a carriage bearing a crest that made grown men cross the street. She collapsed onto the plush velvet floor, shaking. That's when she smelled it. Expensive tobacco. The scent of a storm. She wasn't alone. She looked up. Dark hair. Sharp, chiseled features. Eyes that held the kind of stillness that comes before violence. Not anger, not cruelty, just the absolute unhurried calm of a man who has never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. He watched her like a predator deciding whether the thing that had stumbled into his territory was a threat or simply lost. Then a shadow fell across the window. Robert. His face pressed to the glass, lantern raised, hunting. He began tapping the window. Slow, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Zelda, darling. His voice came muffled through the glass. Smooth, patient, the voice of a man who had never been refused anything for long. Come out now and I'll be gentle. She whimpered. She waited for the Duke to open the door and hand her back like something that didn't belong to him. Instead, Frederick leaned forward. His gloved hand came to rest on her trembling shoulder. Not gripping, not restraining. Just present. Immovable. He will not touch you, the Duke whispered. He tapped the roof twice. The carriage moved forward, gliding past a furious Robert Ray, his lantern swinging, his perfect smile finally cracking at the edges as the fog folded around him and swallowed him whole. But as they drove into the night toward Ashvale Hall, Zelda couldn't stop staring at one thing. Not his scar. Not his stillness. Not even the warm, impossible weight of a hand that had chosen to protect her rather than discard her. The ledger on the seat beside him. Her father's signature. A debt that Frederick had been collecting for years. His carriage had not been parked near the church by accident. She was not rescued. She was chosen. If you're ready for more stories where the unexpected happens, where the forgotten rise, where the powerless outmaneuver the powerful, and where the underdogs turn the entire game around, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. You do not want to miss what's coming next. And hey, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what's on your mind. Your thoughts are always welcome here, and I would love to hear your take on tonight's story. Don't forget to like, share, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment of the drama, the revenge, and the secrets waiting to be uncovered. Welcome to the family. Now let's dive in. The morning of the wedding, Zelda woke to the sound of her mother weeping in the hallway. It wasn't the gentle crying of a mother sending her daughter off to happiness. It wasn't the proud, overwhelmed tears of a woman watching her child step into a new life. It was the broken, guilty sobbing of a woman who had sold her child, and was only now, on the morning the transaction came due, beginning to truly feel the weight of what she had done. The Wallace estate had been crumbling for years. Her father's gambling losses, steady, catastrophic, announced in hushed voices behind closed doors and then not announced at all, had hollowed out what 3 generations had built. Her brother's business ventures, each one launched with great confidence and abandoned with great silence, had taken what little remained. 3 missed mortgage installments. Creditors who had stopped sending politely worded letters and started sending men instead. And then Robert Ray had appeared. He arrived the way certain men always do, already knowing the exact moment the carcass would be ready. He offered to clear every debt, every creditor, every outstanding note, every threat delivered in low voices on the doorstep. Gone. Settled. Finished. All of it in exchange for one thing. Zelda. She had met him only twice before the wedding was arranged. The first time, he had looked at her the way men look at horses at auction, assessing her posture, her bearing, the particular kind of quiet that made a woman manageable. The second time, he had cornered her in the library while her mother entertained guests in the next room. He had not raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. He had simply placed his hand around her throat, not squeezing, just resting there, fingers easy against her pulse, as a man rests his hand on a door he already owns the key to. "You'll learn quickly," he had whispered against her ear, his breath warm with brandy and absolute certainty. Obedient wives live comfortable lives. Disobedient ones learn to fear the dark. He had smiled when he said it. Now, as her mother's 2 maids laced her into the ivory gown, Zelda understood exactly what she was being dressed in. Not a wedding gown. A burial shroud. The lace was suffocating at her throat. The corset crushed her ribs with every breath. The veil fell across her face like a widow's mourning cloth, and the woman looking back at her from the mirror was someone she barely recognized. Pale. Arranged. Already halfway erased. She looked at that woman for a long moment. Then she memorized her. The copper hair pinned into submission. The green eyes that had learned over 22 years to notice everything and reveal nothing. The jaw set just slightly too hard for a bride who was supposed to be happy. She memorized her. Because she was not going to let her disappear. Her father appeared in the doorway. He looked at her the way men look at things they have already sold and cannot bring themselves to see clearly anymore. He opened his mouth. Something crossed his face. Guilt, perhaps, or the distant cousin of it. He closed his mouth. He left without a word. Down the hall, her mother's sobbing grew louder. Zelda stood. She smoothed the lace with both hands. She took one last look at the woman in the mirror. And then she walked to the vestibule's side door, the one that opened onto the lane, the one no one was watching, and she ran. Ashvale Hall materialized out of the fog like something that was never meant to be found. No warm light in the windows. No sound beyond the creak of iron gates swinging open at the carriage's approach, opened by someone who had been expecting them, which meant Frederick had sent word ahead, which meant none of this was as accidental as a man finding a runaway bride in his carriage ought to be. Zelda filed that thought away and said nothing. The interior of the hall was all dark wood and deep velvet and the specific cold of a house that had not been laughed in for a very long time. Candles burned in the sconces but gave the impression of managing darkness rather than defeating it. A housekeeper appeared from a doorway, efficient, unsurprised, as though frightened women in wedding gowns arrived at Ashvale Hall with some regularity. Frederick showed her to a guest room on the second floor. It was larger than her bedroom at home had been in the estate's better years. A fire had already been laid. A dressing gown was folded across the chair. Someone had anticipated her need for it before she had. At the door, Frederick paused. He reached into his coat pocket and held out a key. "You are a guest," he said. "The lock is yours. You may leave at any time." He left before she could answer. She turned the key over in her palm for a long time after his footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed still in her damp wedding gown, and tried to think clearly. She tried to leave in the morning. The carriage, she was informed by a footman who could not have been more apologetic, was being reshod. Terribly inconvenient timing. Perhaps tomorrow. Tomorrow, one of the horses had thrown a shoe on the drive and the coachman had taken the pair of them to the farrier in the village. Perhaps the day after. The day after, the fog on the main road was apparently impassable before noon. The housekeeper said this with a perfectly straight face. Zelda began to understand. She was a guest the way a ship in a locked harbor was free to sail. Technically unrestrained. Practically immovable. Every obstacle was reasonable on its own. Together they formed a wall so polite it was almost insulting. She stopped asking about the carriage. Instead, she started walking the house. Every corridor, every room that wasn't locked, and careful note of every room that was. Every servant's stairwell, every ground floor window, every door that opened onto the gardens. She counted paces. She memorized routes. She had been purchased once already by a man who smiled while he did it. She was not going to wait to discover what Frederick Burkett wanted in return. Whatever it was, she intended to find it herself, before he decided to tell her. He summoned her to the study on the third morning. Not a request. A note, slipped under her door before dawn, written in the same precise hand she had seen on the ledger in the carriage. 3 lines. His name at the bottom. No pleasantries. The kind of note a man writes when he has never once considered that the answer might be no. The study was floor-to-ceiling books and the smell of expensive tobacco and something older beneath it. Cedar, and the particular staleness of documents that had been handled many times by careful hands. Frederick was already seated when she entered. He did not stand. He gestured to the chair across from him the way a man gestures to something he has already decided belongs in a particular place. On the desk between them lay a stack of papers. She recognized her father's signature before she was close enough to read anything else. She had spent her childhood watching him sign things. Birthday cards, permission letters, and in the later years, apology notes to men she was never introduced to. She knew the handwriting the way you know the sound of a door that has always hung slightly wrong. "Sit down, Miss Wallace," Frederick said. She sat. She kept her hands still in her lap. She had learned, somewhere around the age of 14, that stillness was its own kind of armor. He told her plainly. No theater, no preamble, no performance of reluctance. He owned her family's debt. All of it. Purchased from 3 separate creditors over the past 18 months and consolidated into one clean ledger. The chaos of multiple collectors, each with his own threats and timelines and men who knocked on doors at unreasonable hours, had been replaced by a single controlled obligation. His obligation. He slid a document across the desk. She read it without touching it. His proposal was simple. Zelda would perform the role of his duchess. social engagements, public appearances, the carefully maintained fiction of a functioning aristocratic household. She would be presented, attended events on his arm, and conduct herself accordingly. In exchange, the Wallace debts would be forgiven in full. Her family would be left in peace. And Robert Ray's legal claim, every contract, every document that made her his property, would be declared void. "This is still a transaction," she said. "Yes," Frederick said. He didn't flinch, didn't soften it, didn't reach for a more comfortable word. "But in this one, you have read the contract before signing. And you are permitted to refuse." The word permitted landed somewhere between an offering and an insult. She looked at him for a long moment. At the scar. At the eyes that gave nothing away and asked for nothing in return. Or appeared to. "I'll need time to consider it," she said. "You have 48 hours. She took the document when she left. She read it 4 times. Then she began reading everything else she could find. He arrived on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Not under cover of darkness. Not with the furtive energy of a man overstepping his bounds. Robert Ray arrived at Ashvale Hall at 10:30 in the morning, in a lacquered black carriage with his family crest on the door, dressed as though he were calling on an old friend. He had 2 men with him. He had a document in his breast pocket. And he had the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had never once, in his entire life, knocked on a door and not been let in. Zelda heard the carriage from the upstairs corridor. She reached the landing in time to see Frederick cross the entrance hall below. No haste, no visible alarm, the measured stride of a man who had been expecting this and had simply been waiting to see which morning it would choose. She stayed at the top of the stairs, out of sight, close enough to hear everything. The door opened. The 2 men looked at each other across the threshold, the way men look at each other when they share a long history and none of it is good. "Robert," Frederick said. The single word contained nothing. No warmth, no hostility, no invitation. "Frederick." Robert's smile arrived before anything else. Wide, easy, the smile of a man performing graciousness for an audience. "I've come for what's mine." He produced the warrant with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. Legal. Signed. Zelda's name written in clean official type, which made it worse somehow, reduced to 2 words on a page, retrievable property, outstanding item. Frederick took the document. He read it. He handed it back. "This warrant names a Miss Zelda Wallace," he said. "There is no Miss Zelda Wallace residing at Ashvale Hall." Robert's smile didn't move. "Don't be tedious." "As of yesterday morning," Frederick continued, his voice carrying the same temperature it always did, the temperature of a room no one had thought to heat, "the woman in my care is Miss Zelda Burkett, my betrothed. I'm certain you understand that renders any prior contractual claim entirely void." The silence that followed was remarkable. Robert held it for 3 full seconds, long enough to make clear that he was choosing his next move rather than scrambling for one. Then he stepped back. He straightened his already straight cuffs. He smiled again, smaller this time, private, as though something had been confirmed rather than thwarted. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "My mistake." He left without another word. But at the threshold he paused, just for a moment, and looked up at the landing where Zelda stood in the shadows. He didn't look at Frederick, only at her. The smile said nothing that could be repeated in polite company. It said everything else. The door closed. The carriage rolled away. Zelda stood very still at the top of the stairs and understood, with absolute clarity, that Robert Ray was not a man who retreated. He was a man who repositioned. She found it on a Thursday, which felt appropriate. Nothing good had ever happened to the Wallace family on a Thursday. It wasn't cleverness that led her there. It wasn't even the methodical mapping she had been conducting since her first week at Ashvale Hall. The corridors memorized, the locked doors noted, the servants' routes logged like a woman who had always known an exit would eventually become necessary. It was a book. She had borrowed it from the study 3 days earlier, a volume on botanical illustration that she had no particular interest in but which had been sitting at an angle on the shelf, spine outward, as though recently replaced by someone in a hurry. She dropped it on her way back to return it. The spine cracked against the floorboard at the corner of the study, and when she crouched to retrieve it she felt it, the faint, unmistakable give of a board that was not fixed to anything beneath it. She should have left it alone. She came back that night, when the house had settled into its particular brand of silence, and she pressed the board again. It lifted cleanly. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a cord that had been knotted and unknotted many times, was a folder. Inside, letters. A dozen of them, perhaps more, written on plain paper in a hand she didn't recognize. The signature at the bottom of each one was a single name. Caro. She read them in order. Slowly. Twice. The shape of what they described assembled itself the way terrible things always do. Not in a single blow but piece by piece, each letter adding another stone until the weight of the whole became impossible to hold. Her father had owed Caro long before the gambling debts. Not money, something older, something Caro had been holding over the Wallace family for years like a blade resting against the throat, never cutting, just present. A secret. The nature of it was never named in the letters directly, but its power was everywhere in them, in the careful language of a man who knew exactly how much leverage he possessed and had no intention of wasting it. When her father's payments finally stopped, Caro had made his intentions plain. He would collect in the only currency the Wallace family had left, a daughter, and Frederick's first letter to Caro was dated the same week. She sat on the study floor for a long time after that, the papers in her lap, the candle burning low. Frederick had not stumbled onto her family's situation. He had not been a convenient rescue. He had located the debt, engaged with the man holding it, and inserted himself, deliberately, precisely, with the patience of someone playing a very long game, into the exact position he now occupied. She thought about the key he had placed in her hand on the first night. She thought about the carriage that was always unavailable. She thought about the word betrothed, produced so smoothly on Tuesday morning, as though it had been prepared and waiting in his pocket for exactly the right moment. She put the folder back. She replaced the board. She returned to her room and sat in the chair by the window until the sky outside began to lighten, turning it over and over in her mind. He had bought her ruin. The only question, the one she could not yet answer, the one that kept sleep from her until dawn, was whether he had done it to own her, or to keep her alive. She chose dinner. Deliberately. Not the study, where he held the advantage of his own territory. Not the corridor, where conversations could be ended by a door. The dining room, where they were required by the architecture of civility to remain seated, to face each other across a fixed distance, to behave. She waited until the soup had been removed and the second course laid before she said anything. She let the footman leave. She let the silence settle. Then she set down her fork with the particular precision of a woman who has decided, and looked at him. "Tell me about Caro," she said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She watched his face. She had become, over the past weeks, a student of Frederick Burkett's expressions, which was less dramatic than it sounded, because he had so few of them. But she had learned to read the small things. The slight shift in how he held his jaw. The way his eyes changed temperature rather than direction. They changed now. He set down his own glass. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation and finds, now that it has arrived, that he is no more prepared for it than he expected to be. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "The study floor," she said. "The loose board." Something moved across his face that was almost, in another man, what might have been called a wince. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, and she thought he was leaving, thought he was choosing the door after all, and felt something harden in her chest in preparation for it. Instead, he crossed to the fireplace. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a sheaf of papers. She recognized the shape of them before she could read a single word. The Wallace contracts. Every debt instrument. The full architecture of her family's obligation to him. Her father's signature repeating across page after page. He placed them in the fire. She watched them go. Every page catching, curling. The signatures dissolving into ash with a thoroughness that should have felt like relief. "You have been free of the debt since the day you arrived," he said, still facing the fire. "I was waiting until you trusted me enough to believe it." "You should have told me," she said. "From the beginning. You would not have believed me. You don't know that." He turned then and looked at her with the eyes of a man who knew it absolutely, and the worst part was that she could not honestly say he was wrong. "I still might leave," she said. "I know," he said. She left the room. He did not follow. Behind her, the fire settled, and the last of the papers turned to ash, and the distance between what he had done and why he had done it remained exactly as wide as it had been before either of them had spoken. The invitation had arrived 3 days after the fire. A gilded envelope on the breakfast tray, which was already an act of theater. Robert Ray did not do anything without an audience in mind. Inside, an invitation to the Royal Masquerade, printed on cardstock heavy enough to feel like a declaration. And beneath it, in Robert's handwriting, 3 words that managed to contain an entire threat. "See you there." Frederick had read it without expression and set it aside. Attendance, he explained, was not optional. The masquerade was the one social obligation from which a duke could not absent himself without generating precisely the kind of questions that were, at this particular moment, the last questions either of them needed asked. Zelda wore deep garnet silk, a half-mask that covered her eyes and concealed nothing that mattered. Frederick in black beside her, the scar on his jaw pale in the candlelight, his hand at the small of her back carrying attention she had learned, over the past weeks, to read as vigilance rather than possession. She had almost learned to tell the difference. Robert waited. That was the thing she would remember afterwards. Not what he said, but how long he waited to say it. He let the ballroom reach its fullest, loudest point. He let the champagne circulate twice. He let Zelda begin, just barely, to believe that perhaps the 3 words on the card had been designed only to unsettle her, that the evening might pass without incident. Then he stepped to the center of the room and called for silence. What followed was surgical. She had to give him that. He presented the timeline first. Frederick's purchase of the Wallace debts, laid out in precise chronological order, each transaction documented, each creditor named. He presented correspondence, letters between Frederick and the gambling den owners he had used as instruments, stripped of all context that might have explained them. He presented affidavits, signed, witnessed, entirely legal. He did not mention Caro. Not once. The Duke of Ashvale, Robert said, his voice carrying the pleasant, regretful tone of a man performing reluctant honesty, did not rescue Miss Wallace. He manufactured her helplessness. Every debt she carried, he created. Every door she found closed, he locked. She did not escape a forced marriage. She walked from one cage directly into a more comfortable one. The room turned toward her. 200 faces, masked and unmasked, performing the particular London calculation of scandal. How close to stand, how loudly to whisper, which version of the story to carry home. Frederick stood very still. He did not deny it. He did not look at the room. He looked only at her, and she understood, with a clarity that felt like something tearing, that he was waiting. He would not perform innocence for an audience. If she walked away, he would let her go. Robert crossed the floor and extended his hand. "Come home, Zelda." The room held its breath. So did she. She did not take Robert's hand. She did not go to Frederick either. She simply looked at Robert, at the extended hand, the patient smile, the absolute certainty in his eyes that this was already over, and said quietly to no one in particular, "No." Then she walked out of the ballroom. She heard the murmur rise behind her like a tide finding a new shape. She did not look back. She was already calculating. Robert's men had a head start. She knew that the moment she cleared the ballroom doors, knew it the way you know a thing when all the smaller pieces of an evening suddenly arrange themselves into a single legible picture. The invitation, the timing, the public accusation designed to hold every eye in the room while something else happened somewhere no one was watching. The carriage back to Ashvale Hall took 11 minutes. The smoke was visible from the end of the drive. The records room. 3rd floor, east corner. She knew it because she had mapped this house. Every corridor, every stairwell, every window that opened without protest. In the first weeks when escape had seemed like the most important thing she might ever need. She went through the servants' entrance. The main staircase was already thick with smoke rolling down from the upper floor, unhurried and absolute. She took the back stairs 2 at a time, pulled her wrap across her mouth, and went up. The records room door was impassable. The heat coming through the wood was decisive. But she had noted weeks ago that the records room had a casement window, and that the servants' stairwell had an exterior door onto a narrow stone ledge, 12 inches of it, perhaps less, running along the building's east face at the 3rd floor. She had noted it the way she noted everything at Ashvale Hall, as a possibility, as a line on a map she hoped she would never need to use. She opened the stairwell door. The night air hit her, cold and sharp after the smoke. Below, the courtyard was very far away. She did not look down again after that. She moved along the ledge with her back to the stone, hands spread flat against the wall behind her, the garnet silk of her gown pressing against the masonry. The casement window was 8 feet away, then 6, then close enough to touch. She had the window open and the document box in her hands when she heard him behind her. Frederick, moving along the ledge with the same flat-backed precision, 6 inches behind her, his body breaking the wind that had been pushing at her since the moment she stepped outside. He said nothing. He didn't tell her to go back. He didn't tell her it was too dangerous. He simply followed. They came through the casement window together. The records room ceiling came down approximately 30 seconds later, a sound like the house exhaling something it had been holding for years. They stood in the corridor, ash in their hair, the document box between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the ledge hadn't already said for them. The Caro document went before the magistrate the following morning. What it revealed took less than an hour to dismantle everything Robert Ray had spent 2 years building. The blood debt, the collection terms, the payment Frederick had made to transfer it, every pound of it out of his own accounts without condition or announcement. The gambling dens had not been instruments of manufacture. They had been the only leverage available to a man trying to move a target without alerting the hunter. The criminal indictment against Zelda dissolved before noon. Robert left London within the week. The story that followed him was not the one he had arrived intending to tell. Frederick said none of this to her directly. She read it in the solicitor's letter that arrived on Thursday morning, sitting at the window of her room with cold tea and the particular stillness of a person waiting to find out what they feel. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked out at the grounds of Ashvale Hall, the frost still on the grass at this hour, the iron gates at the far end standing open. They had been open since the morning after the fire. She had noticed and said nothing and had not walked through them. Her mother wrote. The letter was mostly tears and apology in roughly equal measure, which was more honesty than her mother had managed in years and landed somewhere between forgiveness and the memory of forgiveness. Her father did not write. She had expected exactly this from both of them, and found that expecting it was its own quiet kind of freedom. She did not speak to Frederick directly for 3 days. On the 4th day she went to his study and sat down across from him without being summoned, which was, she suspected, a language he understood. "You should have told me," she said. "From the beginning." "Yes," he said. "You were arrogant enough to believe you could manage all of it without me knowing." "Yes. And you were right that I wouldn't have believed you." She looked at him steadily. "I hate that you were right about that." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. At the scar she had long since stopped noticing. At the eyes that had somewhere, in the weeks between the carriage and the ledge and the cold corridor with the ash still in their hair, stopped watching her like a predator assessing something small and started watching her like a man trying very hard not to want something he had no right to ask for. She did not tell him she loved him. That would have been moving faster than the truth between them warranted. Instead, she told him she would need the East study for her own correspondence, that she expected full disclosure on any matter touching her family, that if he maneuvered around her again, for any reason with any intention, she would leave and she would not come back. "Those are terms," he said. "Yes," she said. "But this time we've both read the contract." Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Not quite a smile. something that lived just beneath one in the place where a man keeps the things he has stopped believing he deserves. She had decided, somewhere on that ledge with her hands flat against cold stone and the ground very far below, that she was not leaving. Not because she owed him. Not because the gates were open and she had chosen not to walk through them. But because, for the first time in her life, the choice was entirely hers. And that is where we leave them. Frederick Burkett, Duke of Ashvale. A man who spent 2 years engineering a rescue he could never explain, protecting a woman who had every right to hate him for it, and waiting, with the particular patience of someone who has long since stopped expecting good things, to find out if she would stay. Zelda Wallace. A woman who was sold and ran, and mapped every exit in a house she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. Who read every contract before she signed it. Who walked a 3-story ledge in garnet silk and came back through the window carrying the one thing that could save them both. She didn't stay because she owed him. She stayed because she chose to. And if this story found something in you, if you've ever been underestimated or handed a contract you didn't write, or found yourself in a situation that looked like rescue and felt like a cage, then you already know why Zelda ran toward the fire instead of away from it. Some people are worth the ledge. If you made it to the end of tonight's story, I want you to know that means everything. Drop a comment below and tell me what you thought. Did you trust Frederick from the beginning, or did he have to earn it? Let me know. And if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because there are more stories coming. More secrets. More women who refuse to be ledger entries. More men who are something other than what they appear. You do not want to miss what's next. Like, share, and hit that notification bell. The next story is already waiting.